I just pulled up the Wikipedia page. I was lazy and did not do notes on this one. I'm sorry. But I have the like general idea of how I'm talking about the movies and books by now, so I think I think we will be fine. All right, I'll go ahead and get started in a second. Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Katie Schaefer. Today we are talking all about the Cujo novel. So get ready for some dog talk here, because that is an important part of the book, but there are also a lot of other things to discuss with this book. Wouldn't you agree, Katie?
Oh, yeah, quite a few.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and just jump right on into talking about the characters. Obviously, the book is named Cujo, so we know Cujo is an important part of the book, but you have all of these other characters who sort of move the story forward in a way. It takes a while before we even get into the Cujo part of the book, really, which is odd since it's named Cujo, but you have the Trenton family that consists of Donna, Vic, and Tad. Then you have the Cambers, Joe, Charity, and Brett. And those are sort of your two core groups, along with Steve Kemp. And you have some other characters who are mentioned and show up here and there, but really these are your core group, and Cujo is the Cambers dog. So that's sort of the layout for that. But Stephen King really starts off by telling you a lot about these two families.
Yeah, exactly. And that, like, at first, I was like, what are we talking about here? What's the focus of this story? Because it takes a while for him to really
Right.
wrap around and we get there and things are actually happening. There's so much setup that I'm like, did we need this? I'm not sure we needed this.
One of the other things he does, though, too, is he sort of sets up some lore around Castle Rock. Frank Dodd is mentioned, and he is a serial killer who sort of took Castle Rock by storm in the 70s. And since this book came out in 1981, it's something that's sort of fresh on everyone's mind. And you have the Trentons, who are new to town, basically. Vic moved there for his job because he and his partner wanted to get out of the big city. So it's very interesting that there's so much focus on things like that. And I would say, it was like the first 100 pages of the book, and we were like,
Yeah.
okay, where's Cujo? I think we meet Cujo when they take one of the cars to the Cambers early on, but it's kind of like, oh, Tad gets along with Cujo, and that's it. We don't get too much more than that. It's not super in depth or anything like that. And then you finally get into the Cujo aspect of the story a lot more in the last, half of the book.
Right. And the story in the beginning with the setup with Cujo and the uncomfortable feelings already of particularly Donna, but a little bit Vic, is like, okay, I liked that setup. But then there's also the question about the Frank Dodd and the monster in the closet. Because isn't most of the Frank Dodd stuff take place is it the dark half?
I'm honestly not 100% sure on that, but I will use Google and find out right now. We're going to have some live follow-up on this podcast.
Yes. It talks about Frank Dodd and, Tad sees the monster in the closet, and then the monster just straight up says, I'm the ghost of Frank Dodd, in more words than that, but not many. And then it's kind of interlaced throughout the rest of the book. There's lots of talk about Dodd from the police when they finally get involved.
It was the Dead Zone, by the way.
The Dead Zone, that's it.
Brain fart.
I knew it had D in it somewhere. Yes. And that part, before the rabies and the Cujo stuff really starts, I was wondering, is the rabies all just a cover? And like Frank Dodd is possessing this dog?
Yeah, it did seem like the dog was some sort of vehicle, basically, especially when Tad was seeing something in his closet, because we know it wasn't the actual dog. It's not like the dog just moseyed on into town and went into Tad's closet every night.
Right, exactly. And there's a couple points when the cop near the end, when we get there, the cop makes mention of it, of seeing it in Cujo, and I think in the later part, Tad talks about it, but we see from Cujo's perspective, and that's never present there. He never talks about that from Cujo's perspective. Cujo is always sick with rabies, and so it's an interesting choice. And let's be clear here. Stephen King wrote this on a lot of cocaine, and he says he doesn't really remember writing the book, but he wishes he did. And you can tell this has a sense of being kind of all over the place. Usually his stuff is pretty tight, despite its length.
Right.
And all of the backstory has reason and a point. But in this book, everybody gets a backstory. Everybody. To the point of like, sir.
He really dives deep into a lot of the minor characters too. We get that whole section where Charity goes to visit her sister, and it's like, okay, she visited her sister, but all we know is that the sister is different than them, and it didn't really seem to play into things in the long run. It was like, okay, Charity and Brett went on this trip, and for some reason we found out about that whole side of the family and sort of their need to have money, I guess you can say.
Right. And the perspective and the country mouse, city mouse type thing, or as we find out later, the country mouse becomes city mouse. It feels like he wanted to give this little insight into those, the owners of Cujo. And that's kind of interesting. I liked all of the interplay between Brett and Charity. That stuff is very interesting, watching her trying to, as she sees it, save her son from, this crude lifestyle that she sees in her husband. That part of it is very fascinating, and he gets a lot of good emotional play out of that section.
I agree. It is just interesting to me how much of an emphasis he puts on certain aspects of certain characters, and we obviously have the affair as well. Donna is having an affair with Steve Kemp, and Vic finds out about it because she breaks it off, and Steve sends Vic sort of this nasty letter, and it's a really bad way for him to find out, but Donna doesn't even fight him on it when he does find out. She just owns up to it, and he goes away on his work trip, and they sort of try to move past everything in the end, but it's such dire circumstances for both of them by the end of the book to where you're like, okay, I don't think these two people necessarily need to stay together.
Right. How do you recover from that? I mean, not all the stuff before would be enough challenge for a marriage, but then,
right.
Vic has to learn how to live with himself. And Donna, poor Donna, like by the end, I was just like, oh, honey, you're just in a lot of pain right now. And I can't imagine living with that pain. And after going through so much fucking trauma, it's just.
And there's guilt there on her part too.
Right. And I felt myself throughout the book just in my head going, come on, do something. I need you to do something now. Like, take some action, woman. Like, don't you the risks of dehydration? Come on. And I think so it makes her guilt at the end all the more believable.
Exactly. We do have some other characters in this book who appear throughout, and Cujo is actually one of them. Cujo gets mentions in other books and everything like that down the line. But Sheriff George Bannerman has been in this before, and he was also in the Dead Zone, so he was around when the whole Frank Dodd thing went down. So it's just one of those things where you can tell that during this novel, Stephen King is building some of that lore of Castle Rock in this so that it sort of continues on. And, Cujo is something that's still brought up in new adaptations. It was literally in the Castle Rock Hulu show. So it's, Cujo is not going away anytime soon in the Stephen King universe because it's the dog will just sort of live on forever in a sense because of all the stories people can tell based on this sequence of events that happen in this book. But before we get there, these characters are sort of just taken on this ride, and you're like, all right, cool. Is this roller coaster ending
Yeah.
anytime soon? Like, what are we doing? Where are we going? Are we going for a loop? What's happening?
Yes. And like the part with the cops, I imagine, in a lot of things with Stephen King, there rereads are rewarded, because if you then read more books that you haven't read, you can read the ones you have and you see how all the little bits intertwine. And I think, this is still fairly early in his career, and I think this is where things kind of start to happen. Like, he starts to bring in characters from all around. I mean, he's done it before, but he spends a lot of time on it in this book, I think, like with the Frank Dodd stuff. And I think Mason might make an appearance in a future book as well, the DA.
Right. One of the other things I want to discuss real quick here is zingers.
Oh, God.
Because there's a lot of focus on that in this book, and it's something that, I watched the movie right after this. The two have a lot of big differences, but zingers, I was like, I get that this is Vic's livelihood, but why is there so much focus on this cereal? It's
right.
like,
oh my God. So much focus. And I think there was all kinds of that stuff happening in the late 70s and early 80s, because food wasn't nearly as well regulated then as it is now. And I find it kind of funny almost, but I had the same feeling. I was like, why are we learning so much about this cereal? Is it funny? Is it supposed to be funny? Because it's kind of silly, this whole thing. What's going on with that part of it anyway? And all the business jargon, the very 80s business jargon, you can picture them in their very square suits, sitting at a big wood bar and drinking. It's very much of its time, it feels like.
And like I said, I get that it's their livelihood, but at the same time, it's like, okay, is this just serving as yet another crisis that Vic has to deal with on top of everything going on in his personal life? But then when you take a step back and think about it, he has no idea what's happening to Donna or Tad while he's gone until he gets a few days into his 10-day trip. So I think he's probably about halfway through the trip by the time he's like, okay,
something's going on here.
Roger suggested I call the cops, so I'm gonna do that. And then the cops get back to him and he's like, all right, I need to go home now. So it's sort of just this way of having him leave and then not know what's going on, pretty much. That's what it felt like. And I don't know if we needed so much time spent on that. I would have preferred to see more Cujo scenes, but at the same time, then it's like, but Donna wasn't doing anything. So would that have been more exciting? It's sort of this necessary evil, I guess you could say, with having, those Cujo scenes split up so much, because they were stuck in a car, and that can only be so exciting for so long.
Right. It keeps the tension, maintains the tension throughout it that it desperately needs, because it takes so long. And even in the time consideration of sitting in a car for 2.5 days or a day and a half or something, like a full 24 plus hours sitting in a car in the hot sun. Like, I don't know that a human can survive that long in that scenario. Like, everything seems so stretched out. And in some parts, that's good, because by the end, you just really want to know what the hell is going to happen. This confrontation is coming, and what's it going to look like? But then it just, like, I listened to the audiobook of this, and it just like keeps throwing things in, and I would hear it start and like, oh, God damn it. Still not to the scene. Because I just wanted to know so badly what's going to happen. And usually I like that in a book. A good book keeps you wanting to know. But at points, it's just a little too much in Cujo.
That sort of segues us into talking about the format of this book, because I don't know about other copies of the book, but the one I have, it has absolutely no chapters whatsoever. It just has these little one-line breaks when the scene changes pretty much. So,
Yes, that's how it's published.
okay. So even though it's only, a little over 300 pages, it's a pretty long 300 pages because you're not getting those, gaps where a chapter ends and another one begins. It's just all running together. And, there are obviously stopping points, like I said, with those breaks in between scenes, essentially. But I was like, okay, I'm reading. I'm still reading. Where's the dog? I am reading some more. Okay, here's the dog. And, here's the thing I've been waiting for, because even though I had not read or watched Cujo prior to reading this book, I had an idea of what happened, because this is just one of those stories that had an impact, even if, the way the story came out wasn't that great. Just the idea of Cujo is a pretty great one.
It's like a great novella. This story would have been amazing as a novella, and then it would have felt really tight, or maybe even a short story, and that would have obviously forcibly limited the word count. By the time I was done with it and I looked back, I was like, okay, it does feel rich. Like, you do feel like the impatience and the slowness of time passing that she's experiencing by being forced to like kind of see what's going on in all these other people's lives, and yet she's still there, just sitting there, not doing anything except trying to survive. So in that aspect, it works. It makes you feel how long it takes, which can be good or it can be bad. But then when I look back on it, like you said, there's lots of development of side characters, and it's always nice when you see those kind of people pop up again in a future King book. So despite our frustrations with its length, in some ways it's okay.
The breaks in between the Cujo scenes do help sort of just give you an idea of how much time is passing too, because you go visit these other characters and what they're doing, and when you come back to Donna, Tad, and Cujo, you're like, okay, it's been a couple days now, so we should probably start to get really worried at this point. And it's just one of those things where I still like the story, but I think the execution is just a little off more than usual. And like you said, lots of cocaine was happening when this book was written. And he admits as much in his On Writing book, I believe.
Yes, exactly. It's all cocaine. And it's, when you know that, it makes total sense. You can see just the flurried mind flusters and just how intense he must have been writing it, because some of the scenes are just brutal, so brutal. And I will say that when, at the end, when it finally, at so many points, something could go right for Donna, and then it doesn't. The mailman could go and just check the house. No, he doesn't do that. And there's so many points where it's like, oh, God damn it, they made the wrong choice. And so when the right choice is finally made and you know that help is coming, it is so satisfying. That moment, I was like, oh, yes, finally, we're getting to the denouement here. I'm ready for it.
Why don't we go ahead and talk more in depth about the ending then? Because that is sort of the big thing that we've been waiting for, and it has such an impact on all of the characters, because you have Charity and Brett finding things out. You have everything that happened with Donna and Tad in the car, and then Vic having to cope with that on his own for a bit. And, obviously the big thing is Tad ends up dying from dehydration, exposure, and sort of just being trapped in a car for days. So it's one of those things where you do feel bad for Donna by the end of this, even though she isn't necessarily the best person at the start of the book with the affair and everything like that. You can always tell that Steve Kemp was the worst person of the two when it came to that affair, and there's just so much guilt in Donna, and she has rabies at the end, so she has to go recover from that. And Vic's sort of just like, my wife is in the hospital, my son is dead, and Charity and Brett find out that Joe is dead because, Cujo just sort of went on this killing spree before
Right.
Donna was able to kill Cujo herself, which, you always feel bad for the dog because it's not like any of this was actually Cujo's fault either.
Right, right. That's another thing we can lay at Joe's feet because he didn't go get the dog vaccinated.
Yes.
Get your dog vaccinated. Come on now. And yeah, I think the end is just, like I said, it's so brutal. That final scene, the showdown between Donna and Cujo that we've been waiting for when it happens. It doesn't go well for obviously Cujo, but it doesn't go well for Donna either. She takes so much punishment. And then that final moment when she's like, oh, it was so bad. We made it. Things are all right now. It's all good. And then, no, it's not. And she loses her mind. And it was, a real punch to the gut. And it's just as effective as most of his endings for me, in that it's a true horror story, in that only sad things happen.
What did you think of the sort of epilogue at the end there where you see everyone moving on after the fact? I almost think the ending would have been more powerful if they had ended it with Donna going to the hospital. And, this is obviously going to be a big topic of discussion on the podcast, endings in general, because
Right.
you sort of have to nail that. And in this instance, I didn't mind it too much just because, like you said, that was so brutal. And that would have been a very, very brutal ending. And it's still brutal because you have Vic and Donna and they're never going to be the same. And they're sort of just trying to move on. And then you have Charity, who is probably a little happier that Joe is dead.
Yeah.
And obviously Brett is not happy about that because he looked up to his dad quite a bit and would help him out in the shop and everything like that. But you have these two families coping in different ways. And I think that's something that's important to see. I don't know if it's necessarily the right spot to end it on, though, because in a sense you're like, wait, but now I kind of want to know more, because you did
Yes.
all of this build up with these characters in the beginning, and then you sort of just are like, yeah, life goes on.
Right. Which that point is okay. Yes. Even after all tragedy, life goes on. That I understand. But that's kind of how I felt after you get through the scene where she goes to the hospital and then they go away, and then finally Cujo goes away, and that point it's like, okay, there you go. There's your ending. That's stop, period. No more. And then there's more. There's always more. And so it's not as necessarily as satisfying to have more information about it when you've kind of got your complete story, because exactly. Okay, well, what happens next? Because you haven't finished at a satisfying stopping point if you keep going past. The moment has passed. It's like she says, the moment has passed now.
I want to backtrack a little here because you mentioned the idea of Frank Dodd sort of being a demon and coming back, and I'm looking through the Wikipedia page here and I'm trying to verify this source, but it does say that Frank Dodd is the one spooking Tad out in his closet and everything like that, not Cujo, which obviously, like I said earlier, wasn't going to be Cujo. But that's interesting that they allude to that, because then it's like, okay, does Tad have some sort of powers? Because that's something that's very common in the kids that King writes about. You have Firestarter that focuses on that. Even Carrie, even though she's in high school, she's a little older, but technically still kind of a kid.
Right. And you kind of get that sense from the scenes involving when Vic is back at the house and he's missing, and then he has that weird interaction with the closet, and that's happening at the same time that Tad's right on the edge. And there's another scene where Tad is like, Daddy, and Vic has a dream about him, I think it is, and they're trapped by a monster or whatever. And that's what I wondered too. I was like, does Tad have a little bit of the shine? Which is kind of my assumption when stuff like that happens in King novels. I'm like, oh, you're just throwing a little shine on that one.
Exactly. And I am looking at this article from The Guardian now. They were doing a reread of Stephen King novels, and this was posted, and they do make that connection with Dodd being the monster that never dies. And there's, this thing that says it came to Castle Rock again in the summer of 1980, and that's exactly when Cujo is set. So
Right.
you have these connections that he's weaving, and even if he doesn't remember them, they're there. And I think it's interesting that even being in the state of mind that he was in, he was still able to connect these characters. And I can't even imagine what was going through his mind at that point in time, but it's one of those things where you can tell very early on that Stephen King started building out this universe. Whether he knew how far it would go or not is another story, because he's still releasing books today that are set in Castle Rock. So you have this town that has so much history to it and all these interesting characters within it. And I think you could probably find that in a lot of actual small towns where everyone sort of knows everyone and they know everyone's business and things like that, which does
Right.
not sound appealing to me. I don't
No.
know, but
No.
it's definitely something that feels very Maine to me, because it's like there's not really a big city in Maine. It's like, yes, there's the capital and there's Portland, but how many people are really in Maine?
Right. Exactly. It's not a hugely populous place. Um, yeah, and I think I don't know, I really like that he weaves so much of his stuff together. And I mean, I couldn't imagine writing a novel while binging on cocaine. Skill to be able to pull it out there. And in this one, like I said before, I do like the little sprinkles of Castle Rock that are in there. It makes the town feel bigger when you read about it in other books.
Plus, you have the fact that the Cambers are technically sort of on the outskirts of town, but you even have these little interesting tidbits with, like, the mailman. And it's
Yes.
like,
Oh God.
great, thank you. Good to know the mailman likes to fart in his truck.
Yep. Yep. A lot. And he's worried about it. And he goes to the doctor, and we know all about that. Yes. And I'm sure that mailman has cropped up in other stories because I mean, if you write a good character, why not reuse it?
Yeah, it's very interesting to say the least, that little bit there. And I think one of the other things we should talk about here is just sort of the lasting impact that the story has had. We've mentioned it here and there throughout, but when you have a dog like Cujo, one, Cujo is ginormous because Cujo is a Saint Bernard, and I love big dogs, but I think Saint Bernards are a little too big sometimes. I
They're
mean, they're
huge.
great,
Yeah.
but he just is so powerful. It's crazy. He's denting car doors with his head, having no real impact on himself. And he's breaking through windows and just annihilating everything he runs into and just jumping all over the car. It's just amazing to see what this dog can do, even when it's not rabies infected. These dogs are amazing dogs to look at, and I can't imagine the slobber, but
Right.
that's a different story for a different day, probably, because it's amplified in this too with the rabies.
Right. Foaming
The dog is
everywhere.
just, yeah, foaming at the mouth, and you have this cut on the dog's face from a bat, which that in and of itself is interesting, because if I'm remembering correctly, they never found the hole with all the bats and the dead rabbit in it.
Nope, they didn't. They said it was a fox or a raccoon.
Right. So nobody even knows how this really happened to Cujo, and it's like no one cares enough to like go searching the area for these rabies infested bats.
Right? It's just awful. Like, because Brett still lives there. And it says in the book, I think, that Brett had almost put his foot into the hole more than once. It's like, oh God. So the real danger even is not past. There's still that lurking danger out there that I mean, rabies filled bats that are really close to the Camber home.
Yeah, it's not pleasant to think about, but then again, a lot of things that pop up in Stephen King novels aren't necessarily
No,
pleasant for a reason. And,
right.
you know, we mentioned feeling bad for the dog, and obviously that's something that's going to stick with people for a while too. It's like, yes, this dog was giant and terrifying, but none of it was the dog's fault. And I think just the fact that he can have Cujo mentioned in something in 2018 and have people instantly know exactly what is being talked about, probably regardless of whether or not they've read the book, because I knew exactly what Cujo was without having read the book or anything before seeing Castle Rock. So it's just this story that people continue to talk about. And I know you and I didn't think it was the greatest Stephen King book, and he probably agrees if he doesn't even remember writing it. But, there are going to be some great books and some that aren't as great. I didn't think this was horrendous. It still gave us a good core of a story. It just took a wacky way of getting there. And it's one of those things where, if I give a Stephen King book a 2 or a 3, it doesn't mean I didn't like it or hated it or anything like that. It just means it wasn't as good as some of his best stuff.
Right, you're grading on a scale here.
Yeah.
You can't, Stephen King books are their own thing, especially his early stuff. His early stuff is a lot darker, a lot more brutal, and it's not as well put together really at all. I think some of them are better than others. The Shining is a classic example, but even that one, it's a little sloppy on the execution with how much it veers from story point to story point. So I agree. It's just because it's a 2 or a 3 doesn't mean it's a bad book. It just means it's not as good.
I believe we were also fairly close in our rankings. I have been putting everything up on Goodreads as I go, and I'll link to that in the show notes in case anyone is just interested in seeing my rankings in case I don't mention them on episodes for whatever reason. But I went ahead and I gave it the benefit of the doubt and gave it a 3 out of 5, mostly because you can't do half stars in the Goodreads app, which kind of drives me crazy. It's a nitpick
Yes.
of mine with that app, and otherwise I'm pretty happy with it because I read a lot, so it's very useful. But I know you rated it slightly lower than I did.
Yeah, I would say it's a 2 for me, just because of how long it takes him to get there.
Yeah.
And I just think it could be a little tighter. But the story, if we're rating it on execution, it gets a 2 out of 5. If we're rating it on the story quality, then we're talking more like a 3.5 out of 5. Because the story itself is very interesting and the characters are really well done, and as almost all his characters are. And it's got all the elements of a good story. It's funny, it's scary, it's thoughtful and emotional. So it's still good, just a little tighter, which his next couple books were a little tighter.
Yeah, I am working my way through The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger right
Oh,
now. So
I love that one.
I know that it's going to be a slow process with the Dark Tower books. We're just going to go on a little tangent here because they were so spaced out. So it's going to be a while before I get to everything. And I kind of like that I'm getting to experience a lot of these books for the first time because it just sort of makes me think about them more than I would think about most other books reading them for the first time. Sometimes I just, blow through something and I'm like, okay, that was good. Don't have to think too much about it. I'll, check out the next thing when the next book is out by so-and-so writer. Or if it's nonfiction, it's like a bunch of one-offs that I read. But to have this huge catalog to go through and
Right.
not even including the movies or TV shows or anything like that, just the books is a huge undertaking, as you know, because like we've mentioned,
Yes.
the books get super long. I am not looking forward to the stretch that is like right around the Talisman and I think I don't even know what's around there. Needful Things is somewhere around there, but it's a stretch of very, very large books. So, I'm sort of enjoying the shorter early books from him right now, because my copy of The Gunslinger is only about 312 pages, and the font actually isn't super squished like it is in Cujo.
Right. Yeah. That one's a nice, sweet, short read, and it's a really, really tight story. I really enjoy that one. I think, as much as the later books are really good, I think that one might be my favorite, of just because of how well it's told and how harsh it is. That one doesn't have a whole lot of light at the end of the tunnel.
It is horror that is his specialty, though, so I'm not
Mm-hmm.
expecting too many happy endings here,
No,
which is,
no.
probably a good thing going into this, because then my expectations for them pretty much don't exist.
Right, right. I mean, but he does have some happier books, but
Yeah.
A Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon doesn't have a crushing ending. but but I think I like the darkness in his books, and I think later in his career he learns to temper it a little bit, as we all get a little less intense as we age, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I know this episode is a little on the shorter side for what I typically go for, but sometimes when you don't like something quite as much, it's hard to talk about it as much as the things we do really, really enjoy. We are going to be talking about a lot of different books, just even between the two of us. So it's going to be a very long roller coaster ride here. It'll have some ups, it'll
Mm-hmm.
have some downs, it'll take you for some spins, it'll do all sorts of things that you probably aren't expecting.
That's right. That's Stephen King for you. All the best authors take you on crazy journeys.
Yeah, one final note though, I like how he included a Ford Pinto, which was the first car he bought when he got an advance from
Yes.
writing. So, the Pinto has a special place in his heart, apparently. Not a fantastic looking car, but
No.
apparently has a special place for it.
Yes, I did like how he talks about the bucket seats and all this. I was like, yeah, you really know that car very, very well.
Yeah, well, Katie, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Cujo. Like I said, you'll be back soon. We have lots to discuss, but I did enjoy discussing this probably more than I enjoyed reading it. That seems a little harsh, but sometimes you just have to talk it out.
Yes, I agree. It's good to let it go, and then move on to the next one.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, you can follow at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to this podcast pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple, Google, you name it. I have probably made sure it's there, hopefully, anyway. But, I wouldn't be doing this podcast unless people were listening to it. So I just want to thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.